They laughed at the shelter she built for $8. Silas Brennan, who had survived 12 Kansas winters and buried 3 neighbors with his own hands, told her plainly, "You will be dead before spring. Those children will die with you." He said it the way a man says the sun will rise, not with cruelty, with certainty. Agnes Holbrook was 62 years old. She had 2 grandchildren, a quarter cord of nothing, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12, 1888, the temperature would drop 50 degrees in 6 hours, but that was 5 months away. And in August of 1887, Agnes Holbrook had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. The cave was not much, a shallow bite in the chalk bluff, 15 feet deep and 8 feet high, at the mouth narrowing to a crack at the back, where the rock pinched together like a fist closing on darkness. Water stains ran down the pale stone in long brown fingers, where rain had found its way in over centuries, carving channels no wider than a thumbnail. The floor was uneven, littered with fallen rock and the small, scattered bones of animals that had crawled inside to die. Fox bones, rabbit bones, the delicate architecture of creatures that had sought shelter and found only a place to stop. Agnes stood at the entrance on a morning in August, the sun already pressing its full weight against the Kansas prairie, and looked at what $8 could buy. Behind her, Clara held Emmett's hand. The girl was 7. The boy was 4. They were her son's children. Her son was dead. His wife was dead. Typhoid had taken them both in the span of 11 days the previous spring in a house in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that smelled of camphor and grief in the particular stillness that settles over rooms where people have stopped breathing. Agnes had raised her son alone after her husband died in the mines when the boy was 9. She had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a cook in other people's kitchens. She had kept her son fed and clothed and educated through 30 years of widowhood. And then the typhoid came, and everything she had built was gone in less than 2 weeks, and she was 62 years old with 2 grandchildren who had no one else in the world. The county officials in Lancaster had been polite about it. They had used gentle words. They explained that a woman of her age with no income, no property, no means of support could not reasonably be expected to raise 2 young children. There were institutions, they said, good ones. The children would be fed, clothed, educated. Agnes would be free to live out her remaining years without the burden. Burden. They had used that word as if Clara and Emmett were stones tied to the neck of a woman already drowning. Agnes had smiled at the county officials. She had thanked them for their concern. And that night she had packed everything she owned into 2 canvas bags, taken $12 from the covey tin, where she kept her life savings, walked to the train station with a child on each hand. The train from Pennsylvania had cost $62 for the 3 of them. The wagon ride from the railroad stop at Grainfield, Kansas had cost another $4. She had spent her last real money on flour salt coffee, a second-hand rifle with 17 cartridges, and a hatchet that cost 78 cents. What remained would not buy a single wall of a proper house. What remained was $8. $8 and a hole in the rock. Gove County had been organized only the year before. The land office clerk in Grainfield had looked at her the way people had been looking at her for months. The look that said she was too old, too poor, too female, too foolish to be doing what she was doing. Most settlers wanted flat ground for farming. Agnes wanted something else entirely. She wanted shelter that already existed. Shelter that did not need to be built from materials she could not afford. "Are we going to live in there?" Clara asked. The girl's voice was steady. She had learned steadiness in the months since her parents died, the way children learn things they should never have to learn. "We are going to make it livable," Agnes said. She said it with more confidence than she felt. She said it because confidence was the only currency she had left, and if she stopped spending it even for a moment, the whole account would collapse. The nearest neighbor was Silas Brennan, a Norwegian bachelor who farmed a quarter section 3 miles east. He lived in a sod house he had built himself, a low, dark structure made of cut prairie turf stacked like bricks. He had come to Kansas 12 years ago with strong hands and a young man's certainty that hard work could conquer anything. 12 winners had taken the certainty. The hands were still strong. Word traveled fast in empty country. There were so few people that any new arrival was news, and a 62-year-old widow arriving with two small children to claim a cave was the kind of news that traveled faster than most. By the time Agnes had unloaded her bags from the borrowed wagon, Brennan was riding up on a bay mare that looked better fed than he did. He dismounted slowly the way men do when they are in no hurry because they already know what they are going to find. He studied the cave mouth. He studied Agnes. He studied the cave mouth again. His face had the windburned creases of a man who had spent too many years squinting at horizons that never got any closer. "You are the widow from back east," he said. It was not a question. "I am. This your claim? It will be. I am filing tomorrow." Brennan walked to the cave entrance and stood there with his hands on his hips, looking into the darkness the way a doctor looks at a patient he knows he cannot save. He stood there a long time. Then he turned back to Agnes, and his face held an expression she would come to know well in the months ahead. The expression that said she was already dead. She just did not know it yet. "Ma'am?" His voice was not unkind. That was almost worse. "I have buried 3 neighbors since I came to Kansas. 2 frozen blizzards. 1 starved when his crops failed 3 years running. I have seen men half your age with twice your resources give up by Christmas and head back east with nothing but frostbite and shame." He paused. He wanted to make sure she was listening. "A woman of your years, alone, with 2 small children, living in a hole in the rock." He shook his head slowly, the way you shake your head at something that is already finished. "You will be dead before spring, Mrs. Holbrook, and those children will die with you." Clara pressed closer to Agnes's leg. Emmett was too young to understand the words, but he understood the tone. Children always understand the tone. He buried his face against Agnes's skirt, and she felt his small fingers grip the fabric. "I have survived worse," Agnes said. Brennan looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, faded by years of prairie sun, and they held no contempt. Only a flat and weary certainty born from watching too many people die. "Have you," he said, "have you cut 8 cords of firewood by yourself? Have you hunted your own meat through 3 feet of snow? Have you kept a fire burning for 4 months straight while nursing sick children with nothing but willow bark tea and prayer? 8 cords." The number landed in Agnes's stomach like a stone dropped into still water. "That is what you will need," Brennan continued. 8 cords minimum, and that is for a proper cabin with a good stove and solid walls. For that, he gestured at the cave. "I do not even know what you will need. Nobody lives in caves, Mrs. Holbrook. There is a reason for that. The Cheyenne lived in these formations," Agnes said. "Not 10 years ago, women and children sheltered in this very bluff. They survived." Brennan's expression shifted. Something between pity and the hard edge of a man who has no patience left for foolishness. "The Cheyenne were starving and running from the army," he said. "They were not trying to homestead, and most of them died anyway." He mounted his horse. The leather creaked. The mare shifted her weight, eager to leave. "I will check on you in October," he said. "If you are still alive, I will help you build a proper dugout before the worst cold. But I am telling you now, the way you are planning it, you will not make October." He rode away without looking back. Agnes watched him until he was a dark speck against the pale grass, and then she turned to face the cave. 15 feet deep, 8 feet high at the mouth, a floor of broken chalk and ancient bones. She had $8, 2 grandchildren, and needed 8 cords of firewood she had no idea how to cut. Winter was 5 months away. The first problem was not the cave. It was the distance. The nearest trees, a thin line of cottonwoods along a creek bed 3 miles to the south, might as well have been on the moon. Agnes had no horse, no mule, no wagon. The borrowed wagon had gone back to Grainfield with the man who had brought her a teamster who had charged her $4 and wished her luck with the careful voice people use when they mean goodbye forever. Every stick of firewood she would need for winter would have to be carried by hand, her hands. 62 years old, knuckled with arthritis that flared in cold weather, calloused from decades of other people's laundry. She did the mathematics at night. She had always been good with numbers. Her father had taught her arithmetic when she was Clara's age, scratching figures in the dirt floor of their cabin in the Pennsylvania mountains. He had believed that numbers did not lie, that if you could count a thing, you could understand it, and if you could understand it, you could survive it. So Agnes counted. 1 quart of wood equaled 128 cubic feet, a pile 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, 8 feet long. She had watched her father stack wood every autumn of her childhood. She knew a cord weighed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds, depending on the type of wood. Cottonwood was light, maybe 2,500 pounds per cord, but 8 cords still meant 20,000 pounds of wood. 20,000 pounds, carried 3 miles, by a woman who weighed 112 pounds and whose knees ached when she climbed stairs. At 50 pounds per trip, the most she could realistically carry on her back, that was 400 trips. 400 trips of 6 miles round journey, 2,400 miles of walking just for the firewood. And she had to cut it first, and split it, and stack it. And she had to do all of this while keeping 2 children fed, filing her homestead claim, and making the cave habitable before the first freeze. Agnes lay on a blanket on the cave's uneven floor and stared at the darkness above her and felt the numbers close around her like walls. The numbers did not work. No matter how she arranged them, no matter how she squeezed and stretched and bargained with reality, the numbers did not work. 400 trips at 5 trips per day was 80 days. 80 days of walking 12 miles while carrying 50 pounds with no days off for rain or sickness, or the simple fact that her body was 62 years old and had limits that willpower could not erase. And 5 trips per day was optimistic. 3 was more likely. 3 trips per day was 133 days. Winter started in November. It was August. She had 90 days. The mathematics of impossibility. That was what Brennan had seen when he looked at her. Not a woman, not a grandmother, just numbers that did not add up. She thought about his words. You will be dead before spring. She thought about going back. The train to Pennsylvania would cost $62. She had 8. She thought about the county officials and their gentle words. Institutions. Burden. The way they had looked at Clara and Emmett like problems to be solved rather than children to be loved. She thought about her son dead at 34 and the promise she had made standing beside his bed while the typhoid burned through him like a grass fire. I will keep them safe. I will keep them together, whatever it costs. And then she thought about something else. The cave was not cold. It was August. The Kansas prairie was an oven. The sun hammered the chalk bluffs until the surface rock was too hot to touch and the air above the grass shimmered like water. Settlers in their sod houses were soaking blankets to hang over doorways, desperate for any relief from the heat that pressed down on the land like a giant hand. But inside the cave, the air was cool. Not just cooler than outside, not just shade cool the way a porch is cool compared to a field. It was a different kind of cool entirely. Steady, deep, unchanging. Agnes had noticed it the first day and thought nothing of it. Shade was shade. You took what you could get. But lying awake in the darkness, listening to the children breathe, she realized it was more than that. The air inside the cave was exactly the same temperature it had been that morning, and the morning before, and the morning before that. While the prairie outside swung from blistering noon heat to chilly pre-dawn cold, the cave held steady, like a heartbeat, like something alive that breathed at its own pace and could not be hurried or slowed. She remembered something her father had said, not about firewood or farming or any of the things that settlers talked about root cellars. Her father had built root cellars for half the families in their Pennsylvania valley, deep ones dug 8 feet into the hillside, and he had explained why to a girl who liked numbers and asked too many questions. The earth keeps its own temperature, he had said, 50-some degrees year-round once you get deep enough. The heat of summer cannot reach it. The cold of winter cannot either. The earth remembers what it is, and no weather can change its mind. Agnes sat up in the darkness. Her back ached. Her knees ached. Everything ached. But her mind was moving, Hal. Moving fast, faster than it had moved in months, and the pain did not matter. If the cave was 55 degrees in August, it would be 55 degrees in January. The thought was so simple that she distrusted it immediately. Simple ideas were dangerous. Simple ideas were how people died by thinking a problem was easier than it was. But the more she turned it over, the more it held. She was not imagining the temperature. The cave was cool in August because the rock was cool, because the rock was part of the earth, because the earth held its temperature, the way a cast iron stove held heat long after the fire went out. The chalk bluff was not a wall, it was a thermal mass, 1,000,000 tons of limestone that had been sitting at the same temperature since before there were people on this prairie to feel cold or hot or anything at all. 55 degrees in January was not warm. A person could not live comfortably at 55 degrees, but a person could live. 55 degrees was the temperature of a cool autumn morning. You wore a coat, you moved briskly, you were not comfortable, but you were not dying. And 55 degrees was not zero. That was the thing. That was the number that changed everything. The firewood Brennan had described, the 8 cords, the 20,000 pounds, the 400 impossible trips, all of that was calculated for heating a space from 0 degrees to 65. From the killing cold of a Kansas January to something a human body could survive. That was a 65-degree difference. 65 degrees of heat that had to come from somewhere, and the only somewhere was burning wood. But if the cave held at 55, the math changed. She would not need to heat from 0 to 65. She would need to heat from 55 to 65. 10 degrees, maybe 15 for real comfort. 15 degrees instead of 65. Agnes felt her pulse quicken. She felt something she had not felt since before the typhoid, since before the county officials, since before she had stepped onto a westbound train with $12 and 2 children and no plan beyond the word survive. She felt her mind working. The wood requirement would drop, not by half, by more than half, a fraction, 1/4 maybe less. 1/4 of 8 cords was 2 cords. 2 cords was 5,000 pounds. 5,000 pounds at 50 pounds per trip was 100 trips. 100 trips she could make in a month. 33 days at 3 trips per day. But the cave mouth was open, wide open, 8 feet of gaping hole facing the prairie, and every gust of Kansas wind would blow straight through and carry the warmth away it as fast as she could create it. The cave's temperature would hold only if the cave was sealed. An open cave was just a draft with a roof. She needed to close it, not with a wall. She could not afford lumber. She could not afford nails in the quantity a proper wall would need. She could not afford glass or hinges or any of the things a real building required. She had $8. Agnes lay in the darkness and listened to the wind move across the bluff face and thought about what she had. She had her hands, she had a hatchet, she had the knowledge that willow saplings grew along the creek where the cottonwood stood, and willows bent without breaking if you knew how to work them. She had seen pictures in a book back east of Wickiups, the dome shelters the Apache built from bent poles and hides. Bent saplings, curved walls, a shape that was strong because it was round, the way an egg is strong because it is round, distributing force across its entire surface instead of concentrating it at corners. And she had seen something else. The trash pile behind the general store in Grainfield. A heap of empty tin cans that nobody wanted rusting in the Kansas sun, waiting for someone to haul them away. Saplings she could cut herself. Tin cans she could have for free. The storekeeper would be glad to be rid of his garbage. The idea assembled itself in the darkness, like a watch coming together gear by gear, spring by spring. She would not build a house. She would not build a cabin. She would not build a dugout or a sod house or any of the structures that required materials she did not have. She would build a dome, a curved wall of bent willow saplings covered in flattened tin cans fitted across the cave mouth like a cork in a bottle. Small, maybe 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Small enough to heat with a fraction of the wood a cabin would need. The cave would be her insulation. The rock would be her walls. The chalk that had spent a million years holding the same temperature would be her furnace. $8. That was what it would cost. The hatchet to cut the saplings, some wire to bind the tin, a few small items from the general store. Everything else was free. Trash and willows and the ancient indifference of stone. Agnes lay back down. The children slept beside her, their breathing soft and slow, trusting her completely to keep them alive through what was coming. Above her, the cave ceiling was invisible in the darkness. Around her, the limestone breathed its steady 55 degrees patient, as geology calm as the bones of the earth. She slept. For the first time in weeks, she slept without dreaming of failure. The next morning, she walked to Grainfield. 9 miles each way, Clara walked with her. Emmett rode on Agnes's back until he got too heavy, then walked, then rode again. They reached town by noon, filed the homestead claim, and went to see about tin cans. The general store was a wooden building on the main street, if you could call it a street, a strip of packed dirt between a handful of structures that served as the commercial heart of Gove County. The storekeeper was a man named Harlan Polk, with a belly that strained his suspenders and fingers perpetually stained with tobacco juice. He had small eyes that calculated everything they looked at, measuring the world in terms of what could be taken from it. He listened to Agnes's request with growing disbelief. "You want my trash," he said. "Yes, tin cans, empty ones, as many as you have." Polk stared at her for a long moment. His eyes moved from Agnes to Clara, to Emmett, and back to Agnes, and something shifted in his face. A kind of amusement that had nothing warm in it. Then he started to laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has found something funnier than he expected, and the humor comes from someone else's misfortune. "Old lady," he said, "I have seen some desperate settlers in my time, but you might be the sorriest case yet. You know what people are saying about you, that crazy old widow who is going to live in a cave? That grandmother who dragged 2 babies out to the prairie to die? Now you want to build something out of garbage." Agnes kept her voice level. Her hands wanted to shake. She did not let them. "Will you give me the cans or not?" "Oh, I will give them to you." He was still laughing. "I will give you every blessed can behind this store, and I will throw in some from the hotel too. Christmas came early for you, grandmother." He leaned forward close enough that Agnes could smell the tobacco and old sweat and the sour undertone of a man who believed the world owed him something it had not yet delivered. "But I am telling you right now, you are wasting your time. Whatever fool thing you are building, it will not save you when the real cold comes. I have seen blizzards in this county that would freeze a person solid in 20 minutes. Your little garbage hut is not going to stop that. The only thing that stops that is a proper house with proper heating and proper supplies. Things you cannot afford." He grinned. His teeth were brown with tobacco stain, and his eyes had gone calculating again. "Tell you what, though, when you give up, and you will give up." He held up a hand as if Agnes had been about to protest, though she had not moved. "When you give up, you come see me. I might be able to find some work for a woman who is willing to do certain jobs." His eyes flicked to Clara, then back. "Nothing fancy, but it would keep you and those kids fed until you can afford a ticket back to wherever you came from." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Agnes understood it perfectly. She understood the kind of work he meant, and she understood that he was not offering it out of kindness. He was staking a claim on her desperation the way a man stakes a claim on land. Marking territory, making sure she knew he would be waiting when she fell. Clara's hand tightened in Agnes's grip. The girl understood more than a 7-year-old should. The girl understood the tone, if not the words, and the tone was enough. Agnes looked at Harlan Polk steadily. She looked at him the way she had looked at the county officials in Lancaster, the way she had looked at every person who had ever told her what she could not do, what she could not survive, what she should accept, because acceptance was easier than fighting. "I will take the cans," she said. She walked out of the store with her back straight and her grandchildren beside her. Clara had not let go of her hand the entire time. The girl's grip was fierce, the grip of a child who has learned that the world contains men like Harlan Polk, and that the only defense against them is holding on to someone who will not bend. Behind her, Polk's laughter followed them into the street, and the street carried it into the open prairie, and the prairie swallowed it the way it swallowed everything without effort, without memory, without caring at all. The work began. By September 1st, Agnes had carried 400 tin cans from Grainfield to the cave, making the 18-mile round trip twice a week with a canvas sack on her back and a child on each hand. The numbers were simple and brutal. 50 cans per trip, 2 trips per week, 4 weeks, 400 cans. The numbers did not show what the trips cost her. Her shoulders ached constantly, a deep grinding pain that started in the joints and radiated outward until her entire upper body felt like a single bruise. Her feet blistered, healed, and blistered again, the new skin tender and raw beneath the old. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dresses hung loose. Her face thinned until the bones showed through, and the woman who looked back at her from the creek water when she knelt to drink was older than the woman who had stepped off the train in Grainfield. But the cans accumulated. She flattened each one with a rock, hammering it against the cave floor until it lay more or less flat, then stacked the finished pieces inside the cave where the children could not cut themselves on the edges. Tin on tin on tin. The pile grew, a strange currency, trash transmuted into something that might, if her theory held, be worth more than gold. The saplings came harder. The willows along the creek were thin and numerous, but each one had to be cut with the cheap hatchet stripped of branches and carried 3 miles uphill across open prairie. Each sapling weighed only a few pounds, but she needed dozens, and a few pounds multiplied by 3 miles, multiplied by 62 years of living, added up to something that could not be measured in pounds or miles. Her hands cracked and bled from the work. The hatchet, cheap steel with a loose handle, dulled within a week and needed constant sharpening against a chunk of sandstone she kept by the cave entrance. The rhythm became her life. Sharpen, cut, carry, flatten, stack, sharpen again. The days shortened, the light changed. September moved toward October with the slow inevitability of something that could not be stopped. Clara helped where she could. She handed tools. She fetched water from a seep in the rock a quarter-mile away, carrying it in a tin pail that weighed almost as much as she did. She watched Emmett while Agnes wrestled with saplings and hammered cans. The girl was 7 years old, and she already understood that their survival depended on what her grandmother was building. She did not complain when dinner was thin. She did not cry when she cut her hand on a tin edge. She wrapped the cut in a strip of cloth and kept working. Emmett was too young to help, but he stayed close. He played in the chalk dust outside the cave, stacking rocks, collecting feathers, occasionally bringing Agnes gifts he thought she might need. A smooth stone, a dried flower, a grasshopper dead held carefully in a small fist like something precious. He did not understand what was happening. He only knew that Grandma was building something, and building was interesting to watch. Edith Stenberg noticed the traffic. Edith and her husband Carl had a sod house 2 miles northeast of Agnes's cave. They were the nearest neighbors besides Brennan, and Edith was the only other woman within a day's walk. She came by on a hot September afternoon, carrying a basket of early vegetables from her garden, really to see what the crazy cave woman was doing. Agnes was hammering cans flat when Edith arrived. The pile of finished tin was waist-high. The pile of stripped saplings drying in the sun reached nearly to the cave mouth. Edith stood looking at the materials for a long moment. She was a sturdy woman in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back, hands roughened by the same prairie that roughened everyone's hands. "What are you building?" she said. Agnes explained. "The dome. The cave's constant temperature. the reduced fuel requirements. She spoke carefully, laying out the logic the way her father had taught her to lay out numbers, step by step, fact by fact, letting the mathematics speak for themselves. As she talked, she watched Edith's face shift, from curiosity to confusion to something harder, something like fear. So you are betting your grandchildren's lives, Edith said slowly, on a theory about cave temperatures. The word hit like a slap. Theory. As if the rock beneath their feet were a guess. As if the steady 55 degrees that Agnes felt against her palm every night were imaginary. It is not a theory. The cave is 55 degrees right now. It will be 55 degrees in January. And if it is not, the question hung in the air between them. Two women on a Kansas prairie in September, one standing inside a pile of garbage and bent sticks, the other standing outside looking in. If it is not, Agnes said, I will have a shelter I can heat with whatever wood I have managed to collect, which is more than I would have with no shelter at all. Edith shook her head. We have had neighbors who died in Kansas blizzards, Mrs. Holbrook. The Hendricks family 4 years ago. Father, mother, 2 children. All of them found frozen in their cabin because they ran out of wood. The cabin was properly built. They just did not have enough fuel. She gestured at the saplings and tin cans. You are not building a proper cabin. You are building a toy, a play structure, and you are going to put your grandchildren inside it and hope the winter is not bad. I am building something that fits what I have, Agnes said. $8 does not buy proper. $8 buys this or nothing. $8 buys a ticket to somewhere warmer. Not for 3 people. Edith looked at her with pity so open it was almost a kindness. Then maybe you should have thought of that before you came here. She left the vegetables, turnips and a few small onions, the first food anyone had given Agnes since she had arrived. Agnes fed them to the children that night in a thin soup that tasted like dirt and charity, and tried not to think about what Edith had said. You are betting your grandchildren's lives on a theory. She was. There was no denying it. She was 62 years old, standing in a cave in western Kansas, betting everything she had, which was almost nothing, on the memory of her father's voice explaining root cellars to a girl who liked numbers. If she was wrong, Brennan and Edith and Polk and everyone else would be right. And being right would cost Clara and Emmett their lives. Agnes looked at her grandchildren sleeping in the cave. Clara's arm lay across Emmett's chest, protective even in sleep. Their faces were thin. Their clothes were wearing through at the elbows and knees. They had been on this prairie for 5 weeks, and already they looked like they belonged to it. Already the land was claiming them, reshaping them, wearing them down to fit its own hard geometry. The wind outside shifted, and for a moment it carried a sound. Coyotes. Far off south toward the creek, a thin, wavering cry that rose and fell and rose again. The prairie's own lullaby. The sound of a land that did not care who lived on it or who died. She could still go back. Not to Pennsylvania. She did not have enough for that. But to Grainfield, she could find work. The kind Polk had hinted at, or some other kind. She could put the children in someone else's care temporarily just until she had enough money, just until she could afford something better. Just until, the words that preceded every surrender. Agnes looked at the sleeping children. She looked at the pile of flattened tin and the stripped saplings and the cave wall that breathed its 55 degrees into the darkness, patient and steady and absolutely indifferent to whether she lived or died. Then she picked up the hatchet. She ran her thumb along the edge. It needed sharpening again. It always needed sharpening. She reached for the sandstone and began to grind. Outside, the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and empty, and already cooling toward the season that would try to kill her. The grass was turning brown. The wind had changed, carrying a new edge, a new coldness that whispered of what was coming. 5 months. She had 5 months to finish a shelter that everyone said was impossible to gather enough fuel to survive a winter, that everyone said would kill her, to keep 2 children alive in a cave that everyone said was a grave. The hatchet edge caught the last of the daylight and threw it back at the ski. Agnes kept grinding. The sandstone hissed against cheap steel. The children slept. The cave breathed. And somewhere to the north, beyond the horizon, beyond the brown grass and the chalk bluffs, and the scattered sod houses of Gove County, winter was gathering itself. Patient, certain, coming for everything that was not ready. Agnes ground the hatchet. She would be ready. She had to be. There was no one else. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. No distant relative with money. No charitable organization that would appear at the cave mouth with lumber and nails and the thousand things she could not afford. There was only a 62-year-old woman with a dull hatchet and a pile of garbage and a theory about the temperature of stone. It would have to be enough because there was nothing else. The chalk was softer than she expected. Agnes discovered this on September 15th, kneeling at the cave mouth with a knife in one hand and a hammer in the other, trying to carve a hole deep enough to hold the base of a willow sapling. She had expected stone. Stone was what it looked like, pale and solid and ancient. But the blade sank in almost easily, the chalk crumbling away in soft, white chunks that powdered her knees and dusted her hands and made Emmett sneeze from where he sat watching 3 feet away. Soft stone, she could work with soft stone. She could carve holes in it, wedge things into it, shape it. The bluff that everyone saw as a wall was actually a canvas, something that could be cut and fitted and made to hold whatever she needed it to hold. She drove the first sapling into the cave floor that morning. It was a willow rod, 8 feet long, stripped of bark, still slightly green. She angled it inward at maybe 20 degrees from vertical, wedged the base into the carved hole, and packed chalk dust and small stones around it until it stood on its own. It wobbled when she let go, not much, enough to make her stomach tighten. One sapling, she needed 22. The work found its rhythm the way all hard work eventually does. Not a comfortable rhythm, not the kind of rhythm that makes the hours pass easily, the kind that grinds itself into your bones and becomes the only thing you know. Wake before dawn, build the fire, heat water for the children, walk to the creek if wood was needed to, grain field if cans were needed to, the willow stand if saplings were needed. Always walking, always carrying, always moving towards something or away from something, or both at once. By September 20th, she had 11 poles set on the left side of the cave mouth, and 11 on the right, spaced 18 inches apart, forming 2 curving lines that leaned toward each other like hands about to clasp in prayer. The framework looked like the rib cage of some great animal, white willow bones against pale chalk, a skeleton waiting for skin. Now she had to bend them. Willows were flexible. Everyone knew that. Willows bent. It was what they did. What everyone did not know, what Agnes discovered through 3 days of cracking wood and blistering hands, language she would never have used in front of the children if they had been close enough to hear, was that willows were flexible in theory. In practice, an 8-foot sapling with the thickness of a man's thumb had opinions about which direction it wanted to go, and those opinions did not always align with the opinions of a 62-year-old woman trying to bend it into a dome. 2 saplings cracked on the first day. Clean breaks, loud as gunshots in the quiet morning air. Clara jumped at the sound. Emmett laughed, thinking it was a game. Agnes stood holding the broken halves and felt something she could not afford to feel. Despair. Not the large, dramatic despair of tragedy and loss. The small, grinding despair of a problem that refuses to be solved. She had 20 saplings left and needed 22 bent into a continuous curve, and if they kept breaking, she would run out of material before she ran out of cave mouth. She sat on the ground and thought. She thought about willow trees, about water, about the way wood behaved when it was wet versus dry. She thought about the barrel maker in Lancaster who had shaped oak staves into curves by soaking them in troughs of water for days before bending. Oak was harder than willow. If oak could be bent with soaking, willow certainly could. That night, she carried saplings to the creek and submerged them in the shallow water, weighting them down with stones. She left them overnight. The next morning, she carried them back wet and heavy and dripping and tried again. The difference was immediate. The soaked wood bent like something alive, curving under her hands with a slow, steady grace that felt almost cooperative. She tied each sapling at the point where it met its opposite partner, lashing them together with rope and strips of bark, creating a series of arches that rose from the cave floor to a peak 6 feet above the ground. It took her 3 more days to get the technique right. Soak overnight, bend gradually, tie in place, let the wood set for a day while it dried into its new shape, memorizing the curve, accepting it. Then bend further, tie again, wait again. Each arch was a negotiation between what she wanted and what the wood would allow, and the negotiation took patience she did not have, and time she could not spare. But the dome took shape. Clara helped. She handed tools, held saplings in place, while Agnes tied them, fetch water when the rope needed wetting. The girl worked with a focus that was almost frightening in a 7-year-old, a seriousness that belonged to someone much older. She did not play. She did not complain. She watched her grandmother's hands and learned, and when Agnes's fingers cramped too badly to tie a knot, Clara tied it for her small, steady fingers, doing what old swollen ones could not. Emmett brought gifts, a feather he found near the creek, gray and white from a bird neither of them could name, a round stone, perfectly smooth, that fit in his palm like it had been made for holding, a beetle alive offered on an outstretched hand with the solemn generosity of a 4-year-old who believes that everything beautiful should be shared. Agnes thanked him for each one. She kept the feather tucked into a crack in the cave wall where she could see it while she worked. By October 1st, the skeleton was complete. 22 saplings bent into a dome that spanned the cave mouth, 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall at the center, lashed together with rope and bark into a structure that looked improbable and fragile, and when Agnes pushed against it with both hands, surprisingly solid. The curves distributed force. The lashings held. The chalk anchors gripped. It was not pretty, but it stood, and when the wind blew, it swayed without breaking the way a living thing sways, giving ground to keep from being destroyed. Now came the covering. Agnes started at the bottom, overlapping the flattened cans like shingles on a roof. Each can had to be wired to the framework with thin metal strips she had salvaged from the same trash piles that had given her the cans. The work was tedious and painful in ways she had not anticipated. The tin edges were sharp, sharper after being hammered flat, and they cut her fingers every time her grip slipped. The wire was thin and hard to twist, and it cut too. By the end of the first day of shingling, her hands were striped with small cuts that bled and stung and bled again. She wrapped her fingers in strips torn from an old petticoat and kept working. The blood soaked through the cloth and spotted the tin, leaving small rust-colored marks on the shingles that would still be there months later. Invisible beneath the grime and weather, a record of what the shelter had cost, written in a language only her hands could read. The wall grew, row by row, can by can, wire by wire. The dome acquired its skin, tin over willow over chalk, 3 layers between her family and the Kansas winter. It was not enough, she knew that, everyone knew that, but it was what she had. And what she had was what she would use. On October 3rd, Harlan Polk rode out from Grainfield. He came on a gray horse, sitting the saddle with the self-satisfied weight of a man who owned things and knew what ownership meant. He said he had come to see if Agnes needed supplies. His eyes said something different. His eyes were inventorying. He dismounted and walked around the half-finished structure, poking at the tin with his finger, testing its strength, examining the way the dome attached to the cave walls. He took his time. He was thorough. "Interesting construction," he said. "Would not have thought you could make anything out of garbage." "You gave me the garbage," Agnes said. "I made something out of it." "So I did. So I did." Polk turned to face her, and his expression had shifted into something she did not like. The calculating look was back, but sharper now, focused the way a man looks at a piece of land he is about to make an offer on. "Here's the thing, Mrs. Holbrook. You have got a homestead claim, but you have not proved it up yet. 5 years of continuous residence. That is the requirement. Improvements to the land. I know the requirements. I am sure you do. And I am sure you also know that if you abandon the claim voluntarily or otherwise, it reverts to public domain. Available for anyone to file on, he smiled, the brown teeth, the small eyes doing their arithmetic. I have been thinking about expanding my interests, he said. A little land speculation, you might say. This bluff of yours has potential. Not for farming, obviously, but the chalk here has certain properties. IT, IT could be quarried, processed, sold to builders across the county. There is money in this rock, Mrs. Holbrook. Real money, not the kind of money a person makes living in a cave. Agnes felt a coldness that had nothing to do with October. I am not abandoning my claim. Not yet, Polk said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather or the price of flour. But winter is coming, Mrs. Holbrook. Real winter, the kind that kills, and when it does, he spread his hands, a gesture of openness that was anything but open. I will be here, ready to file the moment your claim lapses. It is nothing personal, just business. He tipped his hat and rode away, and Agnes watched him go with her hands trembling, not from fear, from anger. A deep, hot anger that started in her chest and spread outward until her whole body hummed with it. The kind of anger that is useful, the kind that burns clean and leaves behind something harder than what was there before. Polk did not just want her to fail. He was counting on it. He had been counting on it since the day she walked into his store. The tin cans, the laughter, the crude suggestion about work for a willing woman. All of it had been part of a calculation. Let the old woman have her garbage. Let her play at homesteading. Winter would do the rest, and when it did, Harlan Polk would be standing there with his filing papers and his brown-toothed smile ready to take what the cold had shaken loose. She was not just fighting the winter. She was fighting him. Fighting the land office clock that would erase her claim if she abandoned it. Fighting a man who saw her failure as an investment opportunity and her death as a business transaction. Agnes looked at her half-finished dome. She looked at her cut hands. She looked at Clara, who had heard everything and understood enough to be frightened, and at Emmett, who was stacking rocks in the dirt and humming to himself, oblivious. She picked up the wire and went back to work. Silas Brennan came by on October 5th, 2 days after Polk. He had said he would check in October, and Brennan was a man who did what he said. No more, no less. He sat on his horse for a long time looking at the dome. Agnes kept working wiring cans into place, not stopping for conversations she did not have time for. Finally, Brennan dismounted and walked closer. He examined the framework with his hands, tugged at the tin shingles, pressed his palm against the cave wall where the dome met natural stone, looked at the mud and dried grass Agnes had used to seal the joints. Huh, he said. It was the most positive sound Agnes had heard in months, a single syllable that contained, if not approval, then at least the absence of condemnation. Brennan was not a man who wasted words on praise, but he was also not a man who lied, and the fact that he did not say "this will kill you" was in its way the highest compliment he could give. The idea is sound, he said slowly. In theory, the cave holds temperature. I will grant you that. And a small space is easier to heat than a large one. Any fool knows that. He turned to face her. But, Agnes braced herself. There was always a but. How much wood do you have? She told him. A quarter cord, maybe a third if she was generous with her counting. Brennan repeated the number like a judge reading a sentence. A quarter cord. Mrs. Holbrook, it is October. First snow could come any week. A quarter cord might last you 2 months if you are lucky and the winter is mild. It will not get you to spring. I will get more. How? You have spent 2 months building this structure. The creek is not getting any closer. Your knees are not getting any younger. And once the snow comes, you will not be able to make those trips anymore. The drifts on this prairie pile higher than a man's head. I have seen drifts bury sod houses to the roofline. Agnes had no answer for him. She had known in the back of her mind that the wood was a problem. She had pushed the knowledge down, focused on the shelter, told herself, that the shelter's efficiency would compensate for the shortage. But hope was not mathematics. Hope did not burn at 3,600 degrees and produce heat. Hope did not stack into cords and measure in cubic feet. Brennan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, not soft. Brennan did not do soft, but less hard. I am telling you this because I do not want to watch you die, he said. You are stubborn and maybe a little crazy, but you have worked harder than most men I know. Harder than most men half your age. That counts for something. It does not count for enough to stop a Kansas winter, but it counts for something. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canvas sack, heavy tied at the neck with twine. Venison, he said, dried. Should keep you through October if you ration it. Agnes took the sack. It weighed maybe 10 pounds, enough protein to keep 3 people alive for a month if they stretched it thin. She held it against her chest and felt its weight and understood that this was not just food. It was time. 10 pounds of dried venison was 30 days she did not have to spend hunting. 30 days she could spend cutting wood instead. And Brennan hesitated. It was the first time Agnes had seen him hesitate about anything. I have got some scrap wood, cottonwood mostly. Not the best for burning, but it is wood. I will bring you a quarter cord if you will trade me labor in the spring. It was the kindest thing anyone had offered Agnes since she had arrived in Kansas. It was the first thing anyone had offered that was not pity or warning or the suggestion that she should give up and accept whatever lesser life was available to a woman of her age and circumstances. I will take it, Agnes said, and I will work your spring planting if I am able. If you are able. Brennan shook his head. God help you, woman. I hope this contraption of yours works, because if it does not, I do not know what else to tell you. He rode away. Agnes stood holding the venison and watching him go and feeling something she had not expected. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. The knowledge that she was not entirely alone, that in a county full of people who expected her to die there was one man who was willing to bet a quarter cord of wood that she might not. She went back to wiring tin cans, one painful inch at a time. The first frost came on October 19th. Agnes woke before dawn to find ice on the water bucket inside the cave and her breath hanging in the air like smoke. The children were curled together under every blanket they owned, Clara's thin arm wrapped around Emmett's body, holding him close, even in sleep, the way she had held him every night since their parents died. The shelter was not finished. 3/4 of the dome was covered in tin, but a section near the top remained open. A gap maybe 2 feet wide where she could not reach without a ladder she did not have. She had been stacking rocks to stand on, building a precarious tower of chalk and limestone that wobbled every time she shifted her weight. The height was tricky, the footing was unstable. One fall could break a hip, and a broken hip in October in a Kansas cave was a death sentence for 3 people. The gap had to be closed. Today, now, before the frost settled in and became the new permanent condition of the world. Agnes worked through the morning. She climbed her pile of rocks again and again, reaching up into the cold air, wiring cans into place while her fingers went numb and her breath came in ragged gasps. Her hands shook from the cold and from the effort and from the simple biological reality that 62-year-old hands shake when they are pushed past what they were designed to endure. Clara brought her water that was half ice. Agnes drank it and climbed again. By noon, the gap was 6 inches wide. By 2 o'clock, it was closed. Agnes climbed down from her rock pile for the last time and stood back breathing hard, her hands bleeding from half a dozen new cuts, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She stood there for a long time, longer than she needed to, because something in her needed to see it whole before she could believe it was real. She looked at what she had built. It was ugly. There was no other word for it. The cans did not match. Some were rusted brown, some still silver bright, some printed with faded labels for peaches and beans and condensed milk. Some bent at odd angles where she had forced them to fit curves they were never meant to follow. The framework bulged in places where the saplings had not aligned perfectly. The edges where the dome met the cave walls were sealed with mud and stuffed with dried grass, creating a lumpy border that looked like it might crumble in a strong wind. But it was finished, and when she stepped inside and pulled the canvas door closed behind her, the difference was immediate. The wind stopped. It did not diminish. It did not fade. It stopped. One moment she could hear it, feel it, the constant low pressure of moving air against her body. The next moment, silence. Or not silence exactly. The wind was still there. She could hear it faintly through the tin, a distant complaint, but it could no longer reach her. For the first time since August, Agnes stood in a space where the air did not move unless she moved it. Outside, an October breeze was cutting across the prairie, the kind that pushed through clothing and made your eyes water and reminded you that this was only the beginning, that this was the gentle wind, the polite wind, and its brothers were coming from the north with teeth. Inside the shelter, the air was still, still and cool. Not warm, not yet, but not the biting cold that had woken her that morning. A different quality of air entirely. Contained, held, protected. Agnes built a fire in the small pit she had dug near the entrance, channeling the smoke toward a gap she had left in the upper tin work, a crude chimney no larger than a fist. The wood caught slowly smoldering, then flaring, then settling into a steady burn. Within an hour, the space was warmer than any room she had slept in since leaving Pennsylvania. She checked the tin walls for drafts, found 3, sealed them with mud, checked again, found 1 more, sealed it, checked again, nothing. The air inside the dome was still warm and getting warmer. By nightfall, the interior held at 60 degrees with a fire no larger than her 2 fists. 60 degrees from a fire she could have fueled with kindling. 60 degrees while the prairie outside dropped into the 30s and the wind picked up and the first hard frost of the season settled onto the grass like a white whisper. Clara pressed her hand against the bare chalk, the exposed limestone between the dome's edge and the natural cave ceiling. "Grandma," she said. Her voice was quiet with wonder. "The rock is warm." Agnes touched it. The girl was right. The limestone had absorbed the heat of the fire and was radiating it back slow and steady, the way a cast iron stove radiates heat long after the flames have died. The rock was warm, the ancient million-year-old chalk that had never been heated by anything except the slow, patient warmth of the earth itself, was now storing fire heat and releasing it back into the space like a great stone oven turned inside out. For the first time since she had arrived in Kansas, Agnes felt something she barely recognized. It had been so long since she had felt it that she almost did not know its name. Hope. But October 19th was not January, and hope was not firewood. November came with wind, not the killing wind, not yet, just the constant low moan of air moving across open ground with nothing to stop it for 100 miles in any direction. The sound became the background of their lives, so constant that they stopped hearing it the way people who live near rivers stop hearing the water. The first snow fell on November 8th, 2 inches of white that transformed the chalk bluffs into something strange and beautiful. Pale rock dusted with pale powder under a sky the color of old iron. Clara and Emmett threw snowballs at each other while Agnes stood at the cave mouth and tried to calculate how long her wood would last. The shelter was holding. At night, with a small fire burning the interior, stayed above 50 degrees, sometimes climbing as high as 62 when she built the fire up before bed. The limestone walls had become what she had hoped they would become, a thermal battery absorbing heat during the hours when the fire burned strong and releasing it during the hours when the fire burned low. The tin shell stopped the wind. The dead airspace between the dome's peak and the cave ceiling, the gap she had worried was a flaw, turned out to be insulation, a buffer of still air that slowed the escape of warmth better than any wall she could have built. But the woodpile was shrinking. Every morning it was smaller. Every morning the mathematics grew more desperate. She had 3/4 of a cord now, with Brennan's contribution added. She burned perhaps a 20th of a cord per day in cold weather, more when the temperature dropped below 0. 3/4 divided by 1/20 was 15. 15 days of deep cold. But winter in Kansas was not 15 days of deep cold. It was 90 days, sometimes 100, sometimes more. She made 2 more trips to the creek before the drifts got too deep, hauling herself through snow that reached her thighs, dragging back whatever dead wood she could find and carry. Each trip took most of a day and left tracks in the snow that the wind erased within hours, as if the prairie wanted no record of her passage, no evidence that anyone had been desperate enough to walk 6 miles through chest-deep snow for an armload of dead cottonwood. Each trip left her so exhausted that she could barely light the fire when she returned, her hands shaking, her legs cramping, her lungs burning from the cold air she had been breathing for hours. Each trip added perhaps a week's worth of fuel to the pile. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The numbers she had recalculated in August, the numbers that had seemed so promising when she first understood the cave's thermal properties, those numbers assumed she would have 2 full cords by November. She had 3/4, less than half of what she needed. On November 22nd, Brennan came by with news. He did not dismount. The wind was too bitter for standing still, and his mare stamped and blew steam from her nostrils like a creature that wanted to be anywhere else. "Cold snap coming," he said. Word came up from the south. Riders are saying temperatures might drop below zero before December. Below zero, Agnes nodded. She kept her face still. She had learned to keep her face still when the numbers turned against her, the way a card player keeps his face still when the hand is bad. "How are you holding?" Brennan asked. "The shelter works, 60 degrees most nights with a small fire." Would 3/4 of a cord? Brennan's face said everything his voice did not. 3/4 of a cord with a cold snap coming. 3/4 of a cord with 3 months of winter still ahead. 3/4 of a cord for a woman and 2 children in a cave on a prairie where the wind chill could reach 50 below. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, "I know pride is a hard thing to swallow, but if you need to leave, if you need to take those children to somewhere safer, now is the time. Once the deep cold sets in, traveling will not be possible. Where would I go?" He did not have an answer for that. Nobody did. That was the thing about being 62 and poor and responsible for 2 small lives. The exits had all closed long ago. There was no somewhere safer. There was only here, this cave, this dome, this dwindling pile of cottonwood and hope. "I am staying," Agnes said. "The shelter is better than anything else I could find. And abandoning means losing everything. The claim, the land, the only home these children have." Brennan sat on his horse, steam rising from both of them, snow beginning to fall again. Small flakes that spiraled down through the gray air like ashes from a fire burning somewhere far above. "Then I hope that thing holds," he said, "because what is coming? I have seen winters kill men with twice your preparations. I have seen whole families found frozen in their beds come spring." He looked at the dome, the ugly, magnificent dome, the garbage and willow and mud that stood between Agnes Holbrook and the death that everyone expected. "If you are betting everything on that structure and a theory about cave temperatures," he said, "then I suppose we will find out if you were right." He rode away into the whitening world. Agnes watched him until the snow swallowed him, and then she went inside and built the fire up and held the children close and listened to the wind testing the walls. The temperature dropped to 4 degrees below zero that night. Inside the shelter, the fire burned. The limestone radiated its stored warmth, and Agnes's family slept while the prairie howled outside the tin. But morning showed the woodpile diminished by a visible fraction. She could see the difference. She could measure it with her eyes the way a dying man can measure the light fading at the edges of his vision. December came with teeth. The temperature dropped to 15 below on the 3rd, a cold so deep that the air itself seemed to thicken to become something you had to push through rather than simply breathe. Rose to 10 above on the 7th, a warmth that was not warm at all, but felt like mercy compared to what had come before. Then plunged again. The pattern repeated like a punishment. A few days of brutal cold, brief reprieve, that was not warm enough to be called warm, another plunge. Each cycle ate into the wood supply. Each cycle tested the shelter. Each cycle asked the same question. Will this hold? Will this hold? Will this hold? It held. On Christmas Eve, with the thermometer at the general store in Grainfield reading 18 degrees below zero, the interior of Agnes's dome registered 54 degrees with a fire no larger than a man's head. The limestone walls had become exactly what Agnes had imagined in August, a reservoir soaking up warmth during the less cold days and releasing it during the worse ones. The sealed tin shell held the heat in. The dead airspace above the dome held the cold out. The system worked not perfectly, not comfortably, but it worked. It kept the air above 50. It kept the children alive. Clara made a Christmas ornament that afternoon. She took a flattened tin can, one of the extras that had not been used in the dome, and cut it with her grandmother's knife into a rough star shape. 5 points uneven, the edges sharp where the tin had been cut. She worked slowly, carefully, her small fingers navigating the blade with a precision that Agnes watched with equal parts pride and terror. When the star was finished, Clara tied it with a piece of string to the highest point of the dome's interior framework, the place where the willow arches met at the peak. The tin caught the firelight and threw it back across the chalk walls in a dozen tiny reflections. Moving points of gold on the pale stone, like stars brought inside. Like the night sky condensed and captured and hung from a willow branch in a cave. Is Santa Claus going to find us in a cave? Emmett asked. He was sitting by the fire wrapped in a blanket, his face lit by the flames. 4 years old, he still believed in things. Agnes intended to keep it that way as long as she could. Santa Claus finds everyone, Agnes said. She gave each of them a peppermint stick she had hidden since Grainfield, 2 cents apiece. An extravagance she could not afford and would not have traded for anything. She told them stories about Pennsylvania, about their father when he was a boy, about the snow that fell in the mountains, and the way it looked when the sun hit it in the morning, like someone had scattered diamonds across the whole world. She told them about the time their father had built a snow fort so tall he could not climb out and had to shout for help, until Agnes came and dug him free, laughing so hard she could barely hold the shovel. Clara smiled at that. Emmett asked to hear it again. They fell asleep before the stories ended. They always did. Agnes tucked the blankets around them and added a small piece of wood to the fire and sat alone in the silence of Christmas Eve. The tin star turned slowly on its string. The firelight danced. The cave walls glowed with borrowed warmth. Agnes counted the remaining wood, half a cord, maybe slightly less. 6 weeks of winter remained, possibly 8 if spring came late. At her current rate of burning, she had wood for 4 weeks, maybe 5 if she let the fire die to embers during the warmest parts of the day and rebuilt it only when the cold became dangerous. 4 weeks of wood, 8 weeks of winter. The mathematics still did not work. They were closer than they had been in August. Closer than anyone had thought possible. Closer than Brennan or Edith or Polk or any of the people who had measured her chances and found them wanting. But close was not enough. Close was a word that belonged to horseshoes and hand grenades, her father used to say. In survival, close meant dead with a smaller margin. She needed more wood, and the drifts outside were chest high in places, higher in others. The creek was 3 miles away through snow that would swallow her to the waist. The trip that had taken 3 hours in September would take an entire day now, if it was possible at all. Agnes looked at her grandchildren sleeping warm in a shelter everyone had said would fail. She had brought them this far. She had kept them alive through the worst of December with a dome made of garbage and a theory that the earth remembers its own temperature. But January was coming, and after January, February, the killing months, the months when the cold stopped visiting and moved in when it settled over the prairie like a weight and did not lift until it was ready, when even the strongest settlers ran out of everything and discovered what the land had always known. That strength was not enough. That preparation was not enough, that sometimes the winter was simply bigger than anything a person could build against it. The fire crackled. The limestone breathed its stored warmth into the small space. The tin star turned, Outside, the wind screamed across the empty prairie, searching for something it had not yet killed. Agnes was close, so close, but close would not keep her grandchildren alive if the wood ran out in February with 6 weeks of cold still left to endure. She sat by the fire on Christmas Eve and watched the star turn and thought about numbers. She had always been good with numbers. Her father had taught her that numbers did not lie, but numbers also did not bend. Numbers did not stretch. Numbers did not care about a woman who had come too far to fail and not far enough to survive. Numbers said what they said, and what they said on Christmas Eve of 1887 was this: not enough. Almost, but not enough. Agnes fed the fire one more stick. She watched the flames take it. She watched the woodpile shrink by exactly the amount of one stick measurable, irreversible, one stick closer to empty. Then she lay down beside her grandchildren and closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the fire and the slow breathing of two children who trusted her completely, who had no one else in the world to trust. January was coming, and January in Kansas took what it wanted. January began with a lie. The first week brought temperatures in the 20s, cold but not dangerous. The sun appeared for hours at a time, low and pale, casting long shadows across the snow, but carrying just enough warmth to soften the surface into a crust that almost supported a person's weight. Almost. Agnes broke through with every third step, her boots punching down into the powder beneath, but the walking was possible. That was what mattered. Possible. She managed 2 trips to the creek, bringing back armloads of dead cottonwood that she propped against the cave wall to dry before burning. Wet wood smoked. Wet wood wasted heat, turning water to steam instead of warming air. She had learned this in November and would not make the mistake again. The wood dried slowly in the cave's steady temperature, losing its moisture to the limestone that absorbed everything: heat, cold water, time, with the same ancient patience. It was not much, a week's worth of fuel, maybe 10 days. But it was something, and something had become the currency Agnes traded in. Not enough was the condition. Something was the response. The gap between the two was where she lived. Word had spread through the scattered homesteads about the cave woman who was still alive. Not just alive, warm. The word warm traveled through Gove County like a rumor about gold, passed from soddy to soddy, from dugout to dugout, from the frozen lips of settlers who woke every morning with frost on their blankets, to the ears of settlers who did the same. The old woman in the cave, her shelter holds 60 degrees. 60 degrees with a fire no bigger than your fist. Edith Stemberg came by on January 8th. She came alone, her face red from the cold, her breath making clouds that the wind tore away as fast as she could make them. Her manner was different than it had been in September. The pity was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was something rawer. Curiosity cut with something that might have been shame. "They are saying your shelter holds 60 degrees, Edith said. 55 to 62, depending on the fire. Our soddy barely holds 40 on the coldest nights. Carl stuffs rags in every crack, and we still wake up with frost on the blankets. The children sleep in their coats." Agnes showed her the dome's interior, the sealed tin walls, the mud-chinked edges, the way the limestone radiated warmth that seemed to come from the rock itself, as if the earth had decided to take sides and chosen the woman who had listened to what it was trying to say. Edith walked around the small space, slowly touching the walls, pressing her palms flat against the chalk, the way Clara had done on that first October evening. Her face changed as the warmth registered. Not surface warmth, deep warmth. The kind that comes from mass, from weight, from something so large and old that it cannot be exhausted. "It is like an oven," Edith said. "A stone oven turned inside out. That is exactly what it is." Edith stood in the center of the dome and looked at the tin walls and the willow framework, in the crude chimney hole, in the star that Clara had cut from a can and hung at the peak where it still turned slowly in the heated air. She stood there for a long time. I told you this was a toy, she said. A play structure. I told you it would not work. You did. I was wrong. The words came out slowly, each one costing something. Edith was not a woman who said she was wrong. She was a woman who had survived Kansas by being right, by knowing what worked and what did not, by trusting the hard lessons the prairie had taught her, and dismissing everything that contradicted them. Saying she was wrong meant admitting that the prairie had taught her something incomplete, that a 62-year-old woman with $8 and a pile of garbage had understood something that Edith, with her proper sati and her strong husband and her years of experience, had not. Mrs. Holbrook, she said, I was wrong and I am sorry. You understood something the rest of us did not. It was the first time anyone had apologized. Agnes found she did not know what to say. She had prepared herself for skepticism, for mockery, for the slow grudging acknowledgement that might come in spring if she survived. She had not prepared herself for this. For a woman standing in her shelter and saying the words, I am sorry, with her voice breaking slightly on the second word. Edith left with a promise to send Carl over to discuss the construction. Maybe they could build something similar, she said, in addition to their sadi that used the same principles. It would not be as good as a cave, but it might be better than what they had. For the first time, someone wanted to learn from Agnes instead of warn her. But the mild weather was a liar. Agnes could feel it. Something in the quality of the light, in the way the air tasted when she breathed it, in the absolute silence of the sky. The birds had vanished. Not just the winter birds, the hardy ones that stayed through the cold and picked at whatever the snow left uncovered. All of them. Gone. The sky was empty and the silence was wrong. The morning of January 11th dawned warmer still, 40 degrees by noon, warm enough that snow melted off the dome and ran in thin rivulets down the chalk bluff, cutting channels in the ice that had formed along the rock face. Warm enough that Clara and Emmett played outside for the first time in weeks, throwing slush balls, laughing their voices, carrying across the empty white landscape like something precious and fragile. Agnes watched them and felt uneasy. The warmth was wrong. It was too warm, too sudden, too complete. January did not do this. January in Kansas did not offer 40-degree days like gifts. When January was warm, it was because something cold was coming. Something that needed the warmth in front of it, the way a fist needs the pullback before the punch. She remembered a saying her father had used in the Pennsylvania mountains. The lamb comes before the lion. She brought the children inside before dark. She built a fire larger than usual, larger than she could afford, using wood she had been rationing for weeks. She checked the wood pile, maybe 3 weeks' worth at normal burn rate, 2 weeks if she had to keep the fire high constantly. She filled every container she had with water from the melting snow water that would freeze again soon. She was certain of that now. She could feel it the way old bones feel weather, not in the mind, but in the body and the joints, in the deep architecture of a skeleton that had lived through 62 years of seasons and knew what was coming, even when the thermometer lied. At sunset, she looked north. The horizon was wrong, a darkness there that had nothing to do with nightfall. It stretched from east to west in a solid band, low and heavy, blotting out the last light of the sun as it grew. She had never seen anything like it. It did not look like clouds. Clouds had texture, shape, movement. This was a wall, a physical barrier rolling toward them across the prairie, swallowing the sky as it came, turning the world dark from the top down. Agnes went inside. She barred the canvas door with its wooden brace. She checked the seals, the mud chinking the places where the dome met the cave walls. She added grass to every joint she could reach. She built a fire up another notch, feeding it wood she could not spare. Grandma, Clara's voice was small. What is happening? A storm is coming, a bad one. Agnes looked at her granddaughter, 7 years old, thin from a winter of rationing her dress, letting out twice where it had been, seamed her hair longer than it should have been, because there was no one to cut it properly. But alive, alive because of a dome made of garbage and a theory about cave temperatures and the stubbornness of a 62-year-old woman who refused to accept what everyone told her was certain. I do not know how bad, Agnes said, but we are going to be all right. The shelter will hold. She said it with more confidence than she felt. She had been saying things with more confidence than she felt since August. It was the only skill that mattered. The blizzard struck just before midnight. One moment the wind was gusting, unpleasant but manageable, the kind of wind they had lived with for months. The prairie's constant voice raised slightly louder than usual. The next moment the world ended. That was what it sounded like, the end of the world. A roar that came from everywhere at once, from the sky and the ground, and the air itself, a sound so enormous that it erased all other sounds and replaced them with a single continuous scream. The wind did not blow. It attacked. It struck the dome like a fist, and the tin walls rattled, and the willow framework groaned, and the canvas door bowed inward against its brace, as if something massive and furious were leaning against it, trying to get in. The temperature plummeted. Agnes could feel it even inside the shelter, even near the fire. The sudden bite in the air. The way her breath, which had been invisible in the dome's warmth, suddenly became visible again. Small white clouds that the fire's draft pulled toward the chimney hole. The cold was not coming from outside. It was being pushed in, driven through cracks she thought she had sealed, through gaps in the mud, chinking through the canvas door itself, which was not airtight and never had been. She fed the fire more wood, too much wood, more than she could afford, more than her rationing allowed, more than the careful mathematics of survival permitted. She watched the flames bend sideways as gusts found their way through cracks in the tin, and she watched the wood pile shrink, and she did not care. Mathematics could wait. The cold outside was no longer cold. It was something else entirely, something that killed. By 1 in the morning, the tin walls were shaking with every gust. By 2, she could hear ice crystals striking the metal, a sound like sand being thrown against a window. Continuous, relentless, the storm sandblasting the shelter with frozen air. By 3, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the howling white nothing that pressed against the dome from every direction, testing every seam, every joint, every wire that held the tin cans to the willow frame. Clara woke crying. Agnes pulled her close. Emmett woke silent. That was worse. His eyes were huge in the firelight, fixed on the shaking walls, and he did not speak. He did not cry. He simply stared at the tin panels flexing in and out with each gust, breathing with the wind, and his silence was the silence of a child who has understood something terrible without being told. "Grandma," his voice was barely a whisper, "is the house going to fall down?" "No, the house is strong. The house will hold." Agnes wrapped blankets around the 3 of them, positioning herself between the children and the door. If the shelter failed, if the tin tore away, if the saplings cracked and the dome collapsed and the full force of the blizzard poured into the cave, they would have seconds, not minutes. Seconds. The cold outside was not something you survived by running. It was something that found you and stopped you where you stood. The fire burned. The wind screamed. The night went on forever. At some point in the dark hours, 4 in the morning, maybe 5, Agnes could no longer tell Emmett started coughing. It was the cough she had feared since October. The wet, rattling cough that came from deep in his chest, the cough that had faded in November when the shelter warmed up and the boy's lungs had dried out and everything had seemed like it might be all right. But it was back now, deeper than before. A sound like something broken inside him, something mechanical and wrong, as if the small machinery of his breathing had come loose and was grinding against itself. His forehead was burning. Agnes pressed her palm against it and felt the heat radiating from his skin, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Fever. High fever. In a 4-year-old boy. In the middle of the worst blizzard she had ever seen. The worst blizzard anyone in Kansas had ever seen, though she did not know that yet. She had no medicine. No willow bark, she had used the last of it in December. No honey, she had given the last to Emmett on Christmas Eve. No doctor within 20 miles, and even if there had been one standing on the other side of the canvas door, no human being could survive what was happening outside long enough to walk 20 feet, let alone 20 miles. She had water. She had blankets. She had a fire that was consuming her wood supply at a rate that made her stomach clench every time she looked at the pile. She had her grandchildren, that was all. Agnes held Emmett against her chest, feeling the fever through his clothes, listening to the wet rattle of his breathing. Each breath was a labor. Each breath sounded like it might be followed by silence. Clara pressed close on her other side, her face buried against Agnes's arm, her body shaking. Not from cold, from fear. "Is Emmett going to die?" Clara whispered. "No." Agnes said it with absolute certainty. She said it because absolute certainty was the only thing she had left to give. Not wood, not medicine, not warmth. Certainty. The raw, stubborn insistence that this child would not die because she would not allow it. Because she had not carried two children across 1,000 miles of country and built a shelter out of garbage and survived 4 months of Kansas winter to lose a boy to a fever in the last stretch of cold. Emmett is going to be fine. The fever will break. The storm will pass. We are going to be all right. The shelter shook. The wind found new cracks, new paths through the sealed edges. Needles of cold air threaded through the joints, thin and sharp, almost invisible, but deadly in their accumulation. Agnes stuffed cloth into every gap she could reach, working one-handed, holding Emmett with the other arm. The boy coughed, and the sound was liquid and wrong, and it did not stop. The fire needed more wood. She gave it more wood. Dawn brought no relief. The sun rose somewhere behind the white chaos, invisible, its light diffused into a gray nothing that was neither day nor night, but something in between, a twilight that belonged to no hour and no season and no world Agnes had ever known. The storm had not lessened. If anything, it had grown, the wind's pitch shifting higher, the ice driving harder, the tin walls flexing further with each gust. Emmett's fever had climbed. He was listless now, his eyes glassy, his cough producing sounds that made Agnes's jaw clench and her hands grip tighter. She gave him water mixed with a little sugar, the last of the sugar she had been saving for an emergency she had hoped would never come. She held him upright to ease his breathing, propping him against her chest, his small body burning against hers. Clara sat by the fire. She fed it sticks. She kept it alive. 7 years old, and she understood the stakes without being told. She understood that the fire was life and the woodpile was time, and that both were running out. She fed the fire with the careful precision of a child who knows that waste is death. "Is it going to stop?" she asked. All storms stop eventually. When? Agnes did not know. The blizzard had been raging for 8 hours, then 10, then 12. It showed no sign of weakening. The sound was constant, an unbroken wall of noise that had become the only reality. Agnes could no longer remember what silence sounded like. She could no longer remember what the world looked like without white chaos pressing against every surface. The storm had erased everything. The prairie, the sky, the horizon, the future. There was only this, the dome, the fire, the coughing child, the endless howling dark. And then she heard something else, a sound beneath the wind, not part of the storm, a rhythm, a pattern, something almost like pounding, irregular, desperate, barely audible through the shriek of the blizzard. But there, definitely there, someone hitting wood or stone or frozen ground, over and over, a drumbeat made of desperation. Someone was outside. Agnes pressed her ear to the canvas door, straining to hear through the roar. There it was again, closer than she had thought, maybe 50 feet away, maybe less. Someone pounding on something with the last strength they had, trying to make a sound loud enough to be heard through the end of the world. Someone was out there, someone alive, someone who would be dead in minutes if they did not find shelter. Agnes looked at her grandchildren, Clara feeding the fire with her small, careful hands. Emmett wrapped in blankets, his breathing a wet rattle, his face flushed with fever. If she went outside, she might not find her way back. The whiteout was complete, total. 5 steps from the door and she would be blind. 10 steps and she would be lost. Lost on a prairie where the wind chill had dropped below any number she could imagine, where the cold stopped flesh in minutes and stopped hearts not long after. But someone was out there, someone alive, Someone dying. Clara, Agnes's voice was steady. She did not know how. Stay here. Keep the fire burning. Keep your brother warm. Do not open the door for anyone except me. The girl looked up from the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes enormous. Grandma, do not go. I will be right back. Agnes grabbed the rope they used for a clothesline. 20 feet of hemp frayed at the end, strong enough to hold wet blankets. She tied one end to the door frame, wrapping it twice, pulling it tight. She wrapped the other end around her waist and knotted it against her hip. Then she pulled the canvas door aside and stepped out into the 12th day of January, 1888. The cold was absolute. It hit her like a wall of water, except water was warm compared to this. This was something beyond cold, something that had no name in any language she knew. It penetrated her coat, her dress, her skin, her bones. It reached into her lungs and squeezed. Within seconds, her face was numb. Within a minute, her hands were gone. She could see them gripping the rope, but she could not feel them. They belonged to someone else now. Someone who was not going to survive this. She kept one hand on the rope, the other she stretched in front of her and pushed into the wind, into the white, into the nothing. Toward the sound of pounding. 5 steps. 10. The rope played out behind her, her only connection to survival, her only thread back to the fire and the children and the dome that stood between her family and the death that was everywhere else. The wind hit her from the right, from the left, from above, from angles that wind should not have. It spun the snow into a white so complete that she could not see her own hand in front of her face. The pounding was closer, definitely closer, coming from ahead and slightly left. "Hello!" she screamed. The wind tore the word from her mouth and shredded it. "Help!" a voice answered, faint, desperate, nearly swallowed by the storm. "Over here. Please. Over here." Agnes pushed toward the voice. The rope ran out. She had maybe 20 feet of line, and the voice was still ahead of her, still out of reach. She stood at the end of her tether, the rope taut against her waist, and felt the full weight of the choice. She could go back, follow the rope to the door, go inside, survive. Let whoever was out there die in the snow. No one would blame her. No one would even know. The storm would bury the evidence and the spring would melt it, and by summer there would be nothing left but the question of what had happened, and questions without answers were the prairie's specialty. Agnes untied the rope from her waist. She let it fall into the snow. She kept only the memory of its direction, the angle it had made with the wind, the number of steps she had taken, the bearing of the cave behind her. If she was wrong, if she lost her bearings, she would die out here. Her grandchildren would wait in the shelter, feeding the fire, watching the door, and their grandmother would never come back. She kept moving. Her foot hit something solid, a body. Someone curled on the ground, barely moving, their clothes already stiff with ice. A woman. Agnes grabbed cloth, grabbed arms, grabbed whatever her frozen hands could close around and pulled. The body was heavy, resistant, frozen to the ground in places where moisture had turned to ice and bonded fabric to earth. Agnes pulled harder. She pulled with strength. She did not have strength that came from somewhere deeper than muscle, somewhere that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the thing that drives a person to reach into the dark for a stranger. "Get up," she screamed. "Get up or you will die here." A face turned toward her, a woman's face, ice-crusted, eyes barely open, lips the color of slate. Edith Stenberg. Agnes. The voice was a whisper, confused, fading. "That Agnes, get up, now." Agnes hauled Edith to her feet, draped the woman's arm over her shoulders, and turned to find the rope. It was not there. The wind had shifted, or she had turned wrong, or the rope had been buried in drifting snow. She could not see it. She could not see anything. The cave was somewhere behind her, 20 feet, maybe 30, but behind her and 20 feet meant nothing in a whiteout where every direction looked the same and every direction was death. Then she remembered the wind. When the storm had started, the wind had been from the north-northwest, driving directly against the cave mouth. The shelter's door faced roughly south. If she walked into the wind, she would walk toward the cave. If the wind had not shifted, if her memory was right, if the storm had not changed direction in the time she had been outside. Agnes turned her face into the blast of ice and snow. She let it sandpaper her skin. She let it blind her. She let it do its worst, and she walked. One step, two, three. Edith was barely moving, her weight nearly dead on Agnes's shoulders. The wind screamed, the cold burned. 4 steps, 5, 6, 7, 8. She was going to miss the cave. She was going to walk right past it and keep walking until the cold took them both. 9. Her hand hit stone. The bluff face, the chalk wall beside the cave entrance, rough and cold and real beneath her frozen fingers. She felt along it, scraping her knuckles, finding the curve where natural rock gave way to bent saplings and flattened tin. Finding the canvas door. Anna. Open it, now. She had called her granddaughter by the wrong name. She was so cold that the names had come loose from their moorings. But Clara heard and Clara understood, and the door swung inward and warmth poured out. Warmth, the most beautiful thing in the world. The most valuable thing any human being has ever created. Agnes shoved Edith inside and followed, pulling the door closed, collapsing against it as the wind fought to follow them in. For a long moment there was only breathing, the fire's crackle, Emmett's cough, the distant howl of the storm. Then Edith spoke. Her voice was raw and broken and full of something that sounded like grief. Carl is still out there, and the Wyatt family. We were all trying to reach the Thompson place when it hit. We got separated. Carl went one way, I went another. The Wyatts. I do not know where anyone is. Agnes looked at her fire, her wood pile shrinking by the hour, her grandson burning with fever, struggling to breathe. How many, she asked. How many were with you? 9. The Wyatts have 3 children, and the Polk boy came with us. Timothy, Harlan Polk's son. 9 people, lost in a blizzard, walking along a road that passed within 100 yards of Agnes's cave. 9 people who would freeze to death if no one reached them. Agnes looked at Emmett. She looked at the door. Clara, she said, build the fire up. Use as much wood as you need. She found Carl Steenberg first, 200 yards east of the cave, crawling on his hands and knees through drifts that reached his chest. The rope trick worked this time. She had tied one end to the bluff face itself, anchoring it to a knob of chalk that jutted from the rock, and played it out as she went, following the road's approximate line by memory and wind direction. Carl was barely conscious. His hands were frozen into claws, the fingers locked in a grip that had nothing to hold. His face was the gray-white color of meat left too long in the cold. Agnes got him to his feet and half carried, half dragged him back along the rope to the cave. The second trip brought Cora Wyatt and her youngest child, a girl of 2, who had stopped crying because she no longer had the strength. They had fallen into a drift and could not get out. Cora was screaming for her husband and older children, screaming so loud that Agnes heard her through the storm from 30 feet away. The third trip brought Timothy Polk, 16 years old, the son of the storekeeper who wanted Agnes's land. He had been within 30 feet of the cave entrance, collapsed in the snow, facing the wrong direction. If Agnes had not found him, he would have frozen to death within sight of safety. The fourth trip brought nothing. The fifth brought nothing. Agnes walked the rope to its end, screaming into the wind, and heard no answer. The white swallowed her voice the way it swallowed everything. She went back inside. The shelter was crowded now. 8 people in a space built for 3. Edith was tending Emmett, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, murmuring words Agnes could not hear. Carl sat by the fire, his hands wrapped in strips of blanket, shaking uncontrollably. Cora Wyatt held her daughter and wept without sound, her face a mask of grief so raw that looking at it felt like looking at a wound. Timothy Polk sat apart from the others, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. There were still people missing. Arthur Wyatt, his 2 older children. Out there in the white. I have to go again, Agnes said. You cannot. Edith's voice was hoarse. You have been out 4 times. Your face is frostbitten. Your hands. Agnes looked at her hands. She could not feel them, had not been able to feel them since the second trip. But she could see them, swollen, waxy, the color of old candles, the fingertips darkening towards something that would not heal without cost. I cannot stop. Mrs. Holbrook! Timothy Polk spoke from his place near the fire. His voice was shaking, his young face older than it had been 3 hours ago, aged by cold and fear, and the knowledge of how close he had come to dying. Mrs. Holbrook, my father said you would die in this cave. He said your shelter was worthless. He said you were a crazy old woman who was going to freeze to death with those children and good riddance. The boy's voice broke. He was 16. He was trying not to cry. He was wrong, Timothy said. You saved my life. But if you go out again, you will die. And everyone you have saved will be alone in here when the fire burns down. You cannot save everyone. You have done enough. The wind howled. The shelter shook. Emmett coughed a deep, terrible rattle. Agnes stood by the door and looked at her grandson who needed her, who was fighting to breathe, who might not survive the night if she was not here to hold him upright and keep his lungs clear and feed the fire that was keeping the fever from turning fatal. She could save more people, maybe, if they were still alive, if she could find them, if the cold did not take her first, or she could stay. She could hold her grandson. She could keep the fire burning. She could be here in this room with these people who were alive because of her, instead of out there in the white searching for people who might already be beyond saving. The hardest choice is not between something and nothing. The hardest choice is between something and something. Between two kinds of right that cannot both be done. Between the strangers in the snow and the child in your arms. Agnes closed the door. She sat down beside Emmett. She pulled him against her chest and held him and listened to him breathe, each breath a small war, each breath a victory measured in seconds. She stayed. The blizzard lasted 18 hours. It ended sometime after midnight on January 13th. The wind died as suddenly as it had arrived, collapsing into silence so complete that Agnes thought for a moment she had gone deaf. Then she heard the fire, then Emmett's breathing, then far away a sound she had almost forgotten existed. Stillness. She opened the door. The stars were out, brilliant and cold and utterly indifferent to the damage below. The snow was sculpted into drifts higher than a man's head, strange white architecture that the wind had built and abandoned. The air was 18 degrees below zero and absolutely motionless. At dawn, Silas Brennan and 3 other men broke through the drifts to the cave entrance. They found 8 people alive inside: Agnes, Clara, Emmett, Edith and Carl Steinberg, Cora Wyatt and her youngest, Timothy Polk. The fire had burned down to embers. The woodpile was gone, every stick consumed. The temperature inside the shelter was 52 degrees, cold, but survivable. The limestone, still radiating the heat it had stored over months of small fires, giving back what Agnes had given it, the way the earth gives back what is planted in it, slowly and faithfully, and without any need for thanks. Arthur Wyatt and his 2 older children were found that afternoon, a quarter-mile from the road. They had walked in circles until they could not walk anymore. They died within 300 yards of safety, within 300 yards of a dome made of garbage that would have saved them if they had found it. The snow had covered them. The searchers found them only because a dog kept digging in the same spot and would not stop. Across the prairie, the count was worse. The Henderson family, 5 souls dead in their cabin when the stovepipe cracked and the fire went out. Old man Driscoll frozen on his own porch, his hand on the door latch, 6 inches from warmth. The Westerberg boy, 14, who had gone to the barn to save the livestock and never came back. Everywhere the story was the same. People caught in the open. People who ran out of fuel. People who did not have enough shelter to survive what the 12th day of January had brought. But not in the cave. In the cave, a dome made of garbage and bent saplings had held 52 degrees through the worst blizzard in Kansas history. Everyone who reached Agnes Holbrook's shelter survived. Brennan came back 3 days later when the roads were passable. He stood inside the dome, the miraculous dome they were calling it now, and looked at the tin walls and the willow framework and the mud chinking that had somehow held against 50-mile-an-hour winds and temperatures that froze cattle standing in their tracks. "I told you that you would die," he said. "You did. I told you those children would freeze. You did." He was quiet for a long moment. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. His eyes held something Agnes had never seen in them before. Not pity, not calculation, not the flat certainty of a man who knows how the world works. Something softer, something that looked, if she was not mistaken, like wonder. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, "I have been in Kansas for 12 years. I have survived storms that killed men better prepared than me. I thought I knew what it took to make it through a prairie winter." He paused. "I was wrong. What you build here, I do not fully understand it, but I know it works. And I know you saved lives that would have been lost otherwise. Lives that were lost because the rest of us built what we always build and never thought to ask whether there was a better way." He held out his hand. Agnes shook it. His grip was strong. Hers was weak. The frostbitten fingers still swollen, still healing, still paying the price of 4 trips into the white. "I owe you an apology," Brennan said. "And so does everyone else who told you this was impossible. We were all so certain we knew better. We had survived Kansas. We knew the rules. And you came here with $8 and broke every single one of them and lived." He shook his head. "You understood something we did not. The earth holds its own warmth. You just had to know how to use it." He turned to leave, then stopped. "My neighbor Gustafson wants to build one of these. So does the preacher in Grainfield for the church basement. They are going to need someone to show them how." He looked back at her. "I figured you might be willing to teach. For a fair price, of course." It was the first time anyone had offered to pay Agnes for anything since she had arrived in Kansas. "I will teach them for free," she said. "What I built because I had to. It should not cost anyone else what it cost me." Within a month, 3 new cave shelters had been started along the chalk bluffs. By spring, there were 7. Agnes walked to each site and showed them what she knew: the bent saplings and the overlapping tin, the way the Earth's constant temperature could be harnessed to reduce the fuel a family needed to survive. She explained the principles to farmers who had never thought about thermal mass, to merchants who had laughed at her garbage collecting, to women who had whispered about the crazy old widow in the cave. She explained it patiently. She explained it as many times as anyone needed to hear it. She never charged a cent. Emmett's fever broke 2 days after the blizzard. The doctor from Hayes City, when he finally arrived a week later, called it pneumonia and said the boy was lucky to be alive. Lucky was not the word Agnes would have used. Luck had nothing to do with it. Warmth had everything to do with it. The warmth of the shelter had given his small body the chance to fight, had kept his temperature stable while his lungs cleared, had done what medicine could not, because there was no medicine to do it. He was thin and weak for months afterward, but he lived. Harlan Polk never came to see the shelter. His son Timothy did. Came back twice, in fact once, to thank Agnes again, and once to bring her a sack of flour his father did not know was missing. The boy said his father did not speak of it, did not speak of the cave woman at all anymore. The land speculation scheme had died with Polk's certainty that Agnes would fail, and certainty once dead does not come back. Edith and Carl Steenberg built a stone-lined addition to their soddy, that spring incorporating the same principles Agnes had discovered: small space, sealed walls, thermal mass, efficient fire. Carl's frostbitten hands healed, though he lost the tip of one finger. They named their first son, born that December, Emmett, after the boy who had coughed through the blizzard while his grandmother saved strangers from the snow. Agnes Holbrook proved up her homestead claim in 1892, 5 years after she had arrived with $8 and a theory about caves. She never remarried. She raised her grandchildren in the Bluff shelter, improving it each year. A proper door, a better stovepipe, a stone floor laid flat and smooth. By the time Clara was 12, the shelter was comfortable enough that visitors came to marvel rather than pity. Clara became a teacher. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse in Grainfield for 31 years. She never forgot how to build a fire and she never wasted wood. Emmett became an engineer. He studied at the State College in Manhattan, Kansas, and spent his career designing heating systems for buildings. Efficient ones. Systems that use thermal mass and insulation, and the principles his grandmother had discovered in a chalk cave with $8 and no education beyond what her father had taught her about root cellars. Agnes Holbrook died in 1917 at the age of 92. She died in the same cave where she had held a fevered child while the world outside tried to kill him. She died warm. Clara and Emmett buried her on the bluff overlooking the prairie that had tried so hard to defeat her and failed because it had underestimated what a 62-year-old woman could build out of nothing when nothing was all she had. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 18 below in less than half a day. Wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour. The wind chill plunged to 60 degrees below zero. Cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Cold enough to kill healthy men within sight of their own doors. Silas Brennan, who had survived 12 Kansas winters, had looked at an old woman with $8 and 2 grandchildren and delivered his verdict. "You will be dead before spring. Those children will die with you." He was wrong. In a cave in the chalk bluffs of Gove County, Kansas, a dome made of garbage held steady at 52 degrees while the prairie howled and froze and killed. 8 people huddled inside. Strangers who had become survivors. Doubters who had become believers. A sick child who became a testament to his grandmother's refusal to accept the mathematics of impossibility. The skeptics had done their counting. $8 could not buy a house. An old woman could not cut enough wood. A shelter made of trash could not stop a blizzard. Agnes Holbrook had done different counting. 55 degrees was warmer than zero. A small fire was better than no fire. Something was better than nothing. And sometimes something was enough. The tin star Clara cut still hangs in the Gove County Historical Museum. Tarnished now, the edges rough where a 7-year-old cut it with her grandmother's knife. Beneath it, a small card reads Christmas 1887 from the Holbrook shelter. It catches the light that star, throws tiny reflections across the display case, the same way it once threw reflections across limestone walls while an old woman held her grandchildren and a blizzard tried to break down the door. The storm passed, the star remained.